All right. We are going to finish up Moses tonight, I believe. I believe we're going to finish up Moses. Stephen is going to get to the end of Moses, and he's going to link it to the next generation, which of course was Joshua, and he's going to continue. He's coming to the end of his message. As I said, we're probably about halfway through, a little more than halfway through Stephen's message. This is a deep dive, and that's why I really like these types, is to take and dissect a part of Scripture that certainly has some continued value for us. These are things that we look at and see throughout the Bible, this consistency throughout the Bible, and we certainly see God's plan. You know, the Bible is an overall plan. God's had a plan from the beginning. And although man has tried to derail it with their own manness, is that a word? Manosity. God's plan continues on. And that's why when we talk about Jesus is coming back, that's the fulfillment of the plan. That's the ushering in Christ on the throne. That's also putting him in charge and in a rulership position, what he has wanted for a long time. And then eternity follows. So God will win in the end. We just have to realize that. And that's why we tell that to others. But also, I'm talking to Brother Frank today, talking about tightening up our lives and diving into this stuff more and really reading and poring over and really praying, get deep into our prayers, like really commit to what this is, because, man, Twitter. We're in trouble. I mean, we're in trouble. I don't know who's funding this movement. I don't know where the signs are coming from and the flags are coming from. I mean, this movement is crazy. And getting worse. How's that possible? They've moved on from Black Lives Matter. That movement seems to have come and gone. And now we're taking this personally. This is an eradication. This is another Holocaust is what they're calling for. And yet the people who are against this are the Nazis. So it's scary. It's scary how bad it's getting. They are absolutely calling for an eradication of Israel. So as we study these things, just keep those things in the back of our minds that it kind of feels like we're at a turning point here. There's something different about this one. Typically it's been Black Lives Matter, or, like those sort of things, racial injustice and all that. And all that stuff is terrible. Nobody wants that. But this is God's covenant people, Israel. And this is their enemies from the womb. Ishmael coming after him and wanting to eradicate him and stamp him out. And so this has a different feel to it. This has a prophetical Middle Eastern God's plan feel to it that's different than some of the U.S. problems. Occupy Wall Street. Okay. This is different. And so I hope we're keeping an eye on that without falling into rabbit holes, but nonetheless keeping an eye on it as we study these things.
Is there somewhere where it talks about in end times? I know they talk about it getting worse and the Antichrist has to come and kind of make peace. Is there anything, because this does feel different. It feels like, okay, is the Antichrist going to show up here in the next few years? As this continues to get ugly? Is there anything that you would direct us to?
I think we're told to watch and pray. No one knows the day or the hour. The Antichrist is coming on the scene in 2031 or whatever. There's not a date and time. And so the watch and pray instruction has been from the beginning. He's telling his disciples that. So I think we just watch and pray. I think we keep an eye on things. I think we watch.
It just seems more serious.
It seems very serious. Yeah, this is different.
What was Zion saying the other night? Am I going to have time, right, to have
Right.
kids and all that stuff?
Yeah.
This is, getting
Yeah.
a little scary out
I don't know.
there. These are people, like you mentioned.
There has to be chaos for there to be peace. There has to be chaos for there to be a call for peace. It has to get so bad that all hope is gone except for one guy. And that's what we're going to see. And so I don't think it's getting any better, right? Biden's not going to stop it. He's not doing it now, right? I mean, what can Trump do? Really, he's one guy. I mean, he tried to do it before, but this seems worse. And now it's infiltrated deep into the country. You've got a sitting person in Congress praising the people, chanting Hamas. And this bin Laden anti-American letter is circulating again. And there's people saying bin Laden did the right thing. And I mean, these people have no clue the fire that they're playing with. When we're idolizing Osama bin Laden, I mean, I saw those towers fall. I saw the evil of what happened. I also saw the people cheering in the Middle East as it happened. We've brought all that back, but it's not over there. Now it's here. And that's the difference. And there's these guys in Congress and Michigan. The whole state of Michigan is just about gone. All of Europe is just about gone. In their Quran, they talk about this. They talk about infiltrating quietly and then rising up when the horn is blown, so to speak. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. So watch and pray. Our instruction, watch and pray. I think the emphasis being watching and the emphasis being praying. Okay. So we talked about the plagues last week. Talked about that. As we study Daniel, we'll see more of this because Daniel and Revelation are pretty linked. So we'll get into that. I'm also working on a lesson about the firstborn. We'll talk about that at some point. We'll talk about the doctrine of the firstborn and what that means and why God specifically struck that. So the 10th plague finally breaks Pharaoh's will, causing him in his own mourning to relent and allow the Israelites to leave. Okay, Israelites prepared to leave rapidly. However, God had one more massive miracle for them. And of course, we know this from, if you haven't read the book of Exodus about this, then maybe you've seen the movie, okay, either one, or the Netflix documentary, which I saw on Netflix today, but I didn't watch it yet. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm going to. Especially if Moses' wife is how Brother Derek described. I'm excited to see that part of it. And so the miracle is still coming. God's going to bring them to the brink of utter disaster. How many times has God done this in our lives? He has brought us to the point where we have no other choice but to lean on him. We all have that story. We all have that story where, God, I don't know what you want, but I'm putting it completely into your hands. This is all yours. Maybe I've been holding on to it for a little bit, but this is all yours. And God usually blesses at that point because he takes care of his people. This next miracle by God is perhaps the most extraordinary, magnificent in all of Scripture. They've left Egypt. He allowed them to leave, but he changes his mind. Pharaoh decides to chase them with his entire army to get them back and either re-enslave them, or I think he's mad enough he's just going to kill them. That's what I think he's going to do. He's going to slaughter them. When the Israelites realize this, they start murmuring to Moses. Moses, get used to that. All right? You're leading about 2 million people out. And they're not always going to be happy with you. So they already right away start murmuring, Moses, you freed us. A miracle in and of itself. You killed the firstborn of anything except for anything that had the blood on the doorpost. So God selectively killed the firstborn in all these different areas all over Egypt. And yet we're murmuring that God just brought us out here to kill us. Okay. But again, Moses needed to get used to that. They come to the Red Sea, seemingly nowhere to go. They attempt to cross it. Obviously they'll drown. They try to move backwards. The Egyptian army is moving in quickly. And so only God himself can save him now. So Moses steps forward. Desperate situation, as was brought wonderfully on Sunday in Brother Eric's devotion, declares to the Israelites, stand still and see the salvation of God. Now, that's the craziest thing to do and the most abnormal thing to do. And the world has a tough time understanding that without a relationship with God. When chaos is all around us and things are crazy and there's this and what does God say? Stand still. That's out of the norm. That's why he calls for that, because that means a reliance on him. He doesn't say, figure it out. He doesn't say, fix it. He doesn't say, you've got it, champ, get it done. He says, stand still and watch me deliver you. That goes against our sin nature. Again, it's tough for the world to understand something like that because they don't have that relationship with God to be able to, instead of trying to figure out our problems, we're hitting our knees. It's a big difference there. And so you hope that people in the world, people we witness to, people in our circle, people, friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, whoever, see that and see that difference in us, that we're not freaking out because of Hamas. We're freaking out. We're going to let God do his thing. We either believe God's in control or we don't. And so we're not going to go tackle the Hamas guys or try to clear the Golden Gate Bridge as they're protesting it, or go to Columbia University and freak out on people. It's all part of the plan. It's all part of the plan. Let God handle it. God's in control. God parts the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross over on dry land. And even more than that, when they had all crossed over, God then tells Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots, and on their horsemen. Moses then proceeds to stretch out his hand over the sea, and the sea returns to its full depth while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. The Bible says that the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. I don't think this was pretty. I think they died a pretty quick death. I think chariots were getting caught in mud. Horses were getting caught in mud. Foot soldiers were getting caught in mud. And I think the waters came and just took them out. And it says that the bodies of the soldiers were washing up at the feet of the Israelites. Now, God, when God takes care of it, he takes care of it. And he makes sure it's finality. The waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of the Pharaoh. And not one of them was left standing. After the Israelites had crossed over and seen the supernatural event occur right before their very eyes, then they believed in Moses and the Lord. Because the previous things, the plagues are affecting the Egyptians, but not the Israelites. The death of the firstborn, the institution of the Passover, all that, none of that did anything. The fact that you freed from Egypt, it kind of felt like, okay, now we're going to start getting in rhythm with God. All right. Next, this is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us, whom our fathers, now remember, he's saying now our fathers, right? This is our legacy here. This is our background. Fathers would not obey, but rejected. And in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, ordered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. This isn't much longer after. And so they are already complaining. Moses has disappeared in their eyes to receive the law from God upon Mount Sinai. And so we're going to see what their thoughts were. Stephen now shifts to Moses and his leadership of God's people after the miracles of Egypt. He speaks definitively about the Moses of the Bible and how this was the one God had preserved and spoken to through a burning bush. He reminded them of Moses' words in Deuteronomy 18, 15 and 18. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brother, and him you shall hear. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. A prophet, of course, was Christ. People of Jesus' time understood that a prophet like Moses was to come. So then they saw Jesus feed the 5,000, they said to him, then those men who they had seen the sign that Jesus did said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. I mean, early on, maybe they're thinking this is it. They're still looking for that Messiah. Israel nationally, especially in the Zionist movement, they're still looking for that Messiah. They haven't settled on Christ. They believe Jesus is a rabbi, a good teacher. They don't believe he's the Messiah who's to come. And that's where the Antichrist is going to play in. And so during the ministry of John the Baptist, the scribes sent people to ask John 2 questions in John 1:19. First, now this is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then, are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." The first question was in reference to Malachi's prophecy that Elijah would come as a messenger before the appearance of the Messiah in Malachi 4, 5, and 6. The second question went back to Deuteronomy 18:15 and Moses' prophecy. Even when Philip spoke to Nathanael, he said, "Philip found Nathanael and said, 'We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.'" So they're putting scriptures together. These are people who knew scripture, but the people who knew it the best didn't put it together. Remember, they're reading the same Old Testament that we read, and they're reading the champion version, the second coming version, the version of power and great glory and establishment of a kingdom and putting all the other nations at his feet and all of that. And all of that's coming. But what they don't want is the prophet who's going to come from them, who's going to tell them to repent for the kingdom is at hand. That's what they're not looking for, or they're not as excited about, let's say. And so we see them trying to poke around with John. Remember, God's been quiet for a few centuries now. And so because of that quietness, now there's some activity. And so in this activity, they're wondering, okay, we're starting to see some activity here. This seems like it's from God. And so they're poking around at what they know. And so Stephen points out that it was Christ who was in the congregation, called out of Egypt with them in the wilderness. Christ, being God, led them by the cloud and the pillar of fire. Christ spoke with Moses on more than one occasion. Christ was with Israel and gave them the 10 commandments from Mount Sinai. Remember, Stephen is pointing all this to Christ. He's linking this together for them. They didn't believe it, and we're a few years removed from his death. And because at the end, he's about to really poke them and say that you're stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. And he's going to tell them that they're resisting the Holy Spirit. These religious leaders of the time are resisting the Holy Spirit. And so, as he's going to point out, he's going to tell them, as your fathers did, so do you. So Stephen then takes it one step further. He reminds them of the rejection of Moses and of God by their forefathers. The rejection of Moses and of God was a result of their spiritual status. Israel had rejected God, who had given them salvation, deliverance, and provisions. Yet, they wanted to turn back to Egypt to, once again, be the servants of sin. And this is probably, this might be the biggest sort of macro situation that's similar to our lives. Has anyone ever heard the term, the grass isn't always greener on the other side of the fence? Has anyone ever heard that? Okay. Well, that's what Israel is thinking. Moses, why'd you bring us out here? Even if it's turf, it's still not as green on the other side of the fence. Even fake grass can't even be that green. But the idea is that I want what I either once had or what I think is over there. So they had sort of romanticized their time in Egypt. They had sort of thought more fondly of it than being beaten constantly, being told to do the impossible by making bricks, straw, that sort of thing. They had forgotten that part of it, right? And so when we think about, man, my life would be easier if I just wasn't serving the Lord, but then you forget that you then don't have the Lord. And hopefully at this stage, we have grown a dependence upon him to where we're aware of what he can do, and now we don't want to live without it. And so that's what they were still learning. They were still getting it. So it isn't so much that we don't like Moses. Come on, Aaron, let's build an idol. Okay. But Stephen says their hearts had turned back to Egypt. Their hearts. Not, they're just like, we don't know who this God is, right? We've been slaves. We don't know who this is. It was their hearts had turned back to Egypt. They were yearning. This is Lot's wife looking back and yearning for something that God said, let's get out. Okay, I'm going to bring you out. And so that's what we see happening. They wanted to turn back to Egypt to once again be these servants. They were circumcised people in the flesh, but not in their hearts. While Moses received instruction from Yahweh, they in their hearts had already rejected what God had and had promised and cried to Aaron for something new and familiar. Well, we always fall back on that. What's familiar? What's comfortable? It just in our lives, we fall back to what we think is familiar. It's comfortable. It's that whoopee. It's that blanket. It's that what's comfortable, right? Our daughter, Rachel, she's 24. Uncle Peter got her a blanket from Carter's right before she was born. Brand new, flaming bright white with a beautiful, like a silk stitching around the edge and fluffy and comfortable and soft, right? Perfect for a baby. I mean, just a perfect baby's blanket, okay? And she would take it, and she was younger, and she would take the corners, like the edging all around it, and she'd rub it. She's gonna kill me. She'd rub it, rub it on her lip. It was like her comfort thing, right? We've all had kids who did this, right? Just like rub it on their lip. Oh, it's this comfort. It's this thing. I've got my whoopee, my blankie, you know, and it's a comfort thing for her, right? I'm gonna get a call right after this. It's gonna be like, now we're gonna FaceTime. Oh, good. I've been wanting them to do it all week. So she's like, that thing is no better than a dirty, used dish rag right now. That thing is funky and nasty, okay? It smells bad. She doesn't wash it. She will be 25 in September. Like, that would make dishes smell bad if you used it to wash, okay? Like, that's how funky this thing is. But for her, it's what's familiar, it's what's comfortable. And so for Israel, they wanted what was comfortable, right? They had spent decades and decades, just part of Egypt, part of the culture. They were there. They were around it. And so for them, that was what familiar. So what do they say? They say, just take us back. In our hearts, we're going back. And then to Aaron, make us something that's familiar. And so that's how the devil works. Hey, that's comfortable. That's okay, right? Doesn't he justify bad behavior? Hey, Eve, it's not that bad. Look how good that looks, right? It looks good. And so that's his MO. Taking the angels with him, same thing, right? Come on, guys, we can do better. I can be like the Most High. And so when we see that type of mentality, he's pushing us into what's familiar. And what's familiar is sin. That's why there are overcomers. You overcome sin. Overcome the natural sort of organic feel of sin. That we have to overcome that in order to be God's covenant people. And so for Israel, they had their whoopee. We want to go back because we liked it better, and we want an idol even better, okay? So they cried to Aaron to make gods that they could see and touch. Moses was out of sight, out of mind. The God created was one familiar to them in Egypt, represented their fleshly and carnal nature. It was a golden calf, which in their minds represented Yahweh who'd brought them out of Egypt. Can you imagine? I mean, that's gutsy. And so Aaron collects all the jewelry, they form it, they fashion it, make a golden calf, they're dancing around, and they're saying that this is who brought us out of Egypt. I mean, come on. I mean, that's blasphemous. Blasphemous to say that. That's what they did. Stephen said the forefathers offered sacrifice to the idol and rejoiced. The word rejoice means they kept rejoicing or merrymaking. It was a continual act that was repeated over and over. Not just, hey, we rejoiced, now let's go home. They were continually dancing around it, rejoicing, continually offering sacrifices. It was a continuous action. There were several sacrifices and services of worship toward this image while Moses was on the mount. And they saw the works of their hands, and they continually rejoiced over and over and over and over. Like a Twitter rabbit hole. You go down that thing, it's over. And that's what happened. You just can't stop. It's almost like they blacked out. And we're just going to keep serving. We're going to keep offering. It's getting bigger. It's getting badder. The smoke is getting higher. And the noise and rejoicing is getting louder. And you can't stop. It fuels it. They're fueling each other. Israel did not go back to Egypt physically, but clearly they had returned many times in their hearts. Standing on the same platform of their forefathers' rejection of God, Stephen showed them this rejection in history had repeated itself. With who? Israel of their time, his time. The Israel of Stephen's time. The Israel that rejected the Messiah. The same Israel leadership, the same people, they had let sin completely take over. And they rejected God's plan yet again. So in 42, he says, God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Oh, let's check these guys out. Stephen related to his accusers that Israel's idolatries continued all the way to the Babylonian exile. It was a deep-seated, persistent, and, we have to say it, this was deliberate. They weren't accidentally worshiping other gods. They didn't accidentally ask Aaron to create something familiar to them. They didn't stumble into false god worship. This was an intentional act. And so it was a deliberate act on their part as they wandered for those years in the wilderness. He gave them up to worship the host of heaven. Later, he overpowered them with the Babylonians because they worshiped the idols of Molech and Remphan. Now, come on, we can't let two good false gods go to waste here. So we're going to find out who these guys are. Molech was an Ammonite deity honored by the sacrifice of children. Thus the graphic. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel sternly denounce this practice. How can you not think about today? How can you not think about our children are in trouble? Our kids are in trouble. They're in trouble. They're being offered up in this sense for evil. They're under attack. Can you imagine being a child that age, offering up to a God, to please this God, offering up a child, a baby, a toddler, for this sake? I mean, when God has to send two prophets to specifically talk about this God and the practice of sacrificing children, you see how far Israel had gone. Okay? So Jeremiah 7, Ezekiel 16, and Ezekiel 23, these prophets specifically talk about that this practice is abhorred by God. Abhorred by God. And so why would it be any different today? Right? Didn't Jesus call the children to him and say, come to him like one of these? Like he protected them. He wanted them protected. And so it's our job as parents, as grandparents, as protectors of kids to protect kids. And yet we just saw tonight at a kindergarten drag hour. Yeah, just put that together. At a kindergarten drag show, the drag person was telling and teaching the kids how to chant Free Palestine. I mean, What are we doing? What are we doing? But that's what's happening. Kindergarten drag time. Free Palestine. Kids, ready? Free Palestine. I mean, it always comes back to kids. It will always come back to kids because that's how you get them early. So how old is the kindergarten? 5, 6, 10 years from now? What's in their head? Right? For the kids who saw other kids get sacrificed, what are you going to do? You're going to create a loyalty to this thing because otherwise you're next. And so, our kids are in so much trouble. But that's what we see happening. And by the way, this is what we're going to study. These other nations were already doing this as a common practice. Israel was simply repeating and copying what these other nations were doing. So this was already common practice around there. This is part of the polytheistic system that these outsiders of Israel had in place. We're going to study that, of what was in place around Israel and how one person shifted the focus to one God and Xeroxed, people still use that term, right? Xeroxed the plan God had with Israel and rallied the people around who were doing this and rallied around one God. Okay. The ancient writer Zodiatus, which I think he was a podiatrist. I just made that up. Zodiatus, never mind. All right. There he is. He's like, touchdown Tampa, right there. There he is, right? That's a Bucks fan. The rabbis tell us that the idol having the head of a calf with a crown upon it was made of brass and placed on a brazen throne. The throne and image were hollow, and a raging fire was kindled within. The flames penetrated into the body and limbs of the idol, and when the arms were red hot, the victims were thrown into them and almost immediately burned to death, while its cries were drowned out by the beat of drums. Okay? So imagine this massive thing made of brass. Hot. Yikes. We're going to throw a baby on there. And it's almost immediate death. And so this is what they were doing. Yikes. Although God warned against this practice of this worship, they were repeatedly enticed to adopt the practice of this worship. Many years after settling into the land God gave them, they set up a tabernacle in the valley of Hinnom where they sacrificed their children. Some suggest they did this during the ministry of Amos, which we see in chapter 5. Yikes. That's what we see. Some believe it was the hands up and they were cast into the actual furnace, like the open pit, as you can see. Some believe that the idols were like this to receive the child. Obviously their arms are red hot, seared because of the fire up within. It was hollow. And so within, put the baby in the arms of the altar, of the idol. Okay. Remphan was possibly the worship of the planet Saturn, known by some as the mystery god or the hidden god. This worship may originate as far back as the time of Nimrod or shortly after his death around 1955 BC. Some believe it was an Egyptian idol, and it was transported in a case and set up as a tabernacle or a temple. They made sacrifices to it and worshiped the idol, hoping to gain the pleasure or protection of this false deity. We see this in Numbers 25 and again in Psalm 106. This is why we have to be careful with the things of astrology, the worship or interpretation into some of these things. Because this is what these other nations were doing. They were doing this planet worship, star worship, looking into the signs of things. We have to remember God is the creator of all of this. And we're not left, our lives aren't left to chance because we're a Sagittarius. Whatever that means. Okay? And so that's why we have to be careful with this stuff. We have to be careful with playing with this stuff because this stuff clearly has the devil's influence because God's teaching against it. So if you want to know what the devil is for, look at what God's against. And God's against this type of worship to these astrological signs that are out there. And so we have to be careful with that stuff. Since Molech and Remphan were possibly among the gods of the Egyptians, some of the Israelites may have brought their idols along with them in the wilderness. And so, hey, look at this. So here's the life of Moses. What do we think about this chart? How do we feel about this amazing chart? It's Brother Derek's chart. This is great. You can't really see it. I picked the wrong color. Anyways, this shows the life of Moses. And it shows his life, the years that sojourn in Egypt, 430 years, 400 years of affliction. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the 430-year split. Bondage years, Moses, and then the wilderness, Exodus. This is a great chart, and thank you. Shout out to Brother Derek for putting this together. This is a great chart. Great timeline, number of years. And I concede to his numbers greatness. So he has that knowledge, has done that research, certainly more than I have. And so this is a fantastic timeline on this stuff. So that's it for Moses. So we are done with Moses because he's going to move on. Our fathers had the tabernacle of the witness in the wilderness, as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen, which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob. So look, he's moving on. Moses' group, as we know, disobeyed God. It was at a place called Kadesh Barnea, where they had come up to Kadesh Barnea. They're very close to the promised land. And God is willing to, let's go. We've already moved this far. Let's take the land. And they send in 12 spies. How many know this story? They send in 12 spies to spy out the land, to see. I don't know why they did that. God said, go, just go. Go. But they sent in spies. And 10 of them came back and said, nope, they're too big. They're tall people. They're giants. We were like small bugs. We were like ants compared to them. And so 2 people said, but we have God. Right? How many times in our life have we been part of the 10, and how many times have we been part of the 2? Our lives fall in line with this stuff because people on a whole make the decisions, and we're people. And so we follow the 10 sometimes and be like, I don't know if God can handle this. Well, Caleb and Joshua thought differently. And they said, let's go. We can take them, but they were outnumbered. And so God does not allow them to go in. He tells them, then you're done. And your kids are going to go in. And what do? What's the first thing they do? They try to go in. Well, too late, snappy. Can't. God's plan here. And so God obviously defeated Israel and said, you're going to wander around for 40 years until Joshua and Caleb are going to lead this next generation in. You're all going to die, but your kids are going to go in, and that included Moses. So Stephen in his message is going to move on to the next person, Joshua. At some point, we'll study the book of Joshua, which is one of my favorite books. It's one of my favorite books. I have thought, in my years, I have thought that Joshua's leadership of Israel was probably about as close as Israel's ever been to God. They were pretty in sync. They were a couple of hiccups, Gibeonites, Ai, like you see some of that. But boy, they made it clear. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, right? We're all in. We've seen everyone else die. But we've seen our parents' sandals not give out. And there was still manna. And we were still being led by God. In spite of my parents' disobedience. Now we're growing up and we're going to go in. There was a real closeness there. Joshua's leadership was pretty inspiring. And so they were pretty close. They were pretty close. It fell off a little after that, a lot after that, because they were throwing their kids to Molech. So, but when Joshua was in charge and those guys it felt like they were pretty close. They were pretty in sync with God. And Joshua, there's a good symmetry there. So we're gonna talk about Joshua a little bit. Obviously, we'll get into David. We talked about it a little bit on Sunday, and then continue in his message. I believe it's 51 when he says that they're stiff-necked. Is it 51? Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. 51 is when he wraps it up, calls them out. And right after that, he's got minutes left in his life. Minutes left. And yet he's still standing strong and preaching the word. So any thoughts or questions on getting through Moses? Yep.
Speaking of Moses and Israelites wanting to go back to Egypt, it kind of reminds me of, we see this, like a lot of criminals that are in prison, like they get released and then they end up finding their way to go back because they actually want to go back to that life because they feel safe.
Do you mean actual criminals or Shawshank Redemption? Which one? Because I knew that's what you were thinking. No, that is true. No, that's a real thing. No, that is a real thing.
That I ran across that were in prison, and then you'll find themselves go commit a crime, and it's honestly because they really kind of want
It's what's familiar
to that life because they feel safe.
Yeah.
In that lifestyle, as weird as that sounds.
Yep.
And so it kind of reminds me a little bit of them wanting to go back to something else. It's not good.
You're exactly right. And we, from this perspective, can see that. Aren't we critical of Israel? Like, you dummies. God just released you from Egypt, and you're dinking around with this false God, and, what are you doing? We see that. The people would say, why would you want to go to jail? Like, are you kidding? You want to go back? You just spent 30 years there. I get it. And I think that's why we sort of give them a pass, because we understand that mentality. Because again, in our lives, we do that. We go back to what's familiar. We go back to what's comfortable. We fall into ruts and rhythms and habits of things that we shouldn't be doing because it's familiar. But that's part of overcoming. So someone out of jail has to figure out how to function in this newfound freedom they have. Israel had to figure out how to worship God and get away from these gods. Meaning, if they did bring him with, they should have left him there. Meaning, the all-powerful God, who's cloud and fire, follow him, which he doesn't want these other gods. He's giving the law face to face with Moses. Be patient. Wait on God. Remember, in the chaos of crossing the Red Sea, what did he tell them? Stand still. So while Moses is getting the law, just stand still. Just wait. Just wait. And so Moses is about to come down with 2 tablets that had the finger of God written on there. Doesn't get any better than that. And so you're exactly right. People go back with what's familiar, but as quickly as we want to demonize these guys, and we do the same thing. And so we fall back into stupid habits of things and dumb things that we do because it's familiar. It's that blanket. It's Rachel's blanket because that's familiar. So here she is. She's been married almost 5 years and still has the blanket. But it's familiar. She likes it. It's her thing. That's pretty harmless compared to worshiping false gods the way that these guys were doing with Egypt. So.